So, Genesis chapter 6 again, where we read about a man by the name of Noah. Noah, in this chapter, we find out is doing something that nobody else was doing in his generation. He walked with God. He walked with God. Now, we know about Noah because of, the fact that he built that gigantic yacht, the ark, and we also know that he was associated with the flood as well. And so we know this guy, but we're going to focus on something a little bit different today about who he was. All of it is summed up in verse 9, that little phrase of Genesis chapter 6, where it says, Noah walked with God. Noah walked with God. He was the exception to the rule, you might say. And you know what? In the U.S., we actually like that word, right? We like the word exception. We like to think of ourselves as perhaps exceptional people, or we like to hang out with exceptional people. We like to think of ourselves as pioneers, or our voices being heard in the world around us. But the truth of the matter is that one of our biggest fears is that we would be rejected by our group. That we would be rejected by our group. The crowd is important. Our peers are important to us. And so often we'll do things and we will say things that are simply based upon peer pressure. However, our focus and our theme today is walking with God. And so if we are to walk with God, we need to be courageous. We need to have courage because the world is coming and it's trying to squeeze us into its mold. Trying to squeeze us into its mold because of its pressure. It's interesting. One biologist was experimenting with these processional caterpillars, and he was putting them on a clay pot, around the rim of a clay pot. And these processional caterpillars, he put them in tail, the head caterpillar, head to tail, with the one in front of him, all the way around this clay pot. And there was in the middle of this a plant. And so there was enough food for all of these caterpillars to take part in. But for one full week, the caterpillars marched in a circle around the rim of the clay pot, no one breaking rank, no one going for food. In fact, a week later after this, they all died of starvation and exhaustion. And so peer pressure is actually all the way down to the insect world. It goes all the way to there, but peer pressure, it's real. It is real. Our children deal with it, our teenagers deal with it, even adults. It affects housewives, it affects business people, it affects all kinds of people, even pastors it affects. And especially, I would say, it affects college students, especially so. College students, the ones that are saying, we are the ultimate nonconformists. Somebody once said, college is the place where nonconformists conform to the standard of nonconformity. But today, we're going to look at Noah, who truly was the ultimate nonconformist. We look at this man, we look at the world that he lived in, and we find out what his character was like, even in the midst of great wickedness. We see Noah walked with God. He walked with God. Noah obeyed God. Read, if you would, with me, Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, where it says, Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. And they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. And then it says Noah walked with God. Now, This was a very corrupt time. And if there ever was a time that we should be interested in as the church, it's the days of Noah. Why do I say that? Because Jesus actually said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be when the coming of the Son of Man happens. And so with that in mind, we're actually going to look at four increasing conditions, worldwide conditions in Noah's days that are all marked in the passage by the word earth. By the word earth. This is something that happened in the earth, or it includes all of the inhabitants of the earth at that time. Notice, if you would, the word earth in verse 1. It says, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth. Look at verse 4. It says, there were giants on the earth in those days. And then in verse 5, the Lord saw the wickedness of man. It was great in the earth. And then down, look at verse 11 as well. It says, the earth was corrupt before God, the earth was filled with violence. And so four worldwide conditions that were increasing in the world at that time. Number one, again, let's look at it. There was an increase in population. An increase in population. Look, verse 1, it says, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth. Now, again, remember that the lifespan of man and women, but for that matter, was super long at that time. They were living like 900. Methuselah lived 969 years. And so couple that, the longevity of man and also the birth rate, think about this. There was this incredible population boom, you might say. In fact, two scientists, Dr. Whitcomb and Dr. Morris, who wrote a book on the Genesis account, and taking the genealogical records of the early part of Genesis and then looking at the number of the average kids per family and the longevity of man and all these things, they figured all these things, and they calculated that by the 18th generation from the beginning, Adam and Eve, to the 18th generation, they said that there was, and this is a conservative number, 774 million people on planet Earth at that time, after the 18th generation. That's the lowest conservative estimate of how many people were on planet Earth at that time. Then, think about this. By Genesis chapter 6, there would have been around 1 billion people, if not much more. Again, lowest conservative number, 1 billion people by the time of the flood. Think about that. Think about that. Well, mirror that with our time. We actually did not have 1 billion people since the flood until 1850. 1 billion people. And then by 1930, we had 2 billion people. And then by 1962, we had 3 billion people. And then by 1975, we had 4 billion people. And today, we have around 8 billion people. And so there's this exponential population growth going on in our world right now. Men are once again multiplying on the face of the earth like it was in the days of Noah, which, by the way, makes the walk of Noah so incredible. He was so outnumbered. Nobody else in the entirety of the world except Noah and his little entourage's family walked with God. He stood alone. He stood alone. And let me just say this. If you are what's called a Sunday Christian, once a week ritual, live the way that you want the rest of the week, no regard for God, listen, you are not walking with God. You are not walking with God. It's easy to walk with God when you come around your friends and we're all worshiping together and we're all glorifying the Lord together, praising and worshiping. It's easy when you come together and you do that, and wonderfully so. But when you go out into the world and you're outnumbered and the pressure is on, well, that's what separates the big leagues from the minor leagues. To walk with God. Listen, the only way to walk with God is to have courage or a working faith like it talks about Noah having in Hebrews chapter 11. And so there was this population growth, exponential growth at that time. Secondly, there was an increase in sexual depravity at that time as well. It says in verse 2 that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives. Well, in response to that, seemingly, the Lord says in verse 3, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for indeed he is flesh. And then he declares his years will only be 120 after that. And then it says that there were giants on the earth in those days. Now, the big question that is debated about on this section of scripture is who are these sons of God? There are many books written about it. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago. The most popular explanation by scholars and commentators is that these sons of God actually represented fallen angels, and then that they took human women and have these odd offspring with them, giants, men of renown, as it explains right here. Now, again, there's all sorts of ideas about who these sons of God were. You know, were they sons of Enoch? Were they sons of Cain or Seth? Or were they just kings in the area that were just trying to gain women for their harem? There's a lot of different ideas out there. But what is most important for us to kind of focus in on here this morning is, aside from who or what these beings actually were, is what they were doing was immoral. What they were doing, whatever it was sexual. It was against God's original design for marriage and sexuality. It was against God's design for that. And so God, in response to what they were doing, has to judge the earth because of this sexual depravity, which again, this is not news to us, not at all. This is just like our age is right now. And our age and our culture and our country is marked by sexual depravity. We are a people, by and large, that are depraved. We're always pushing the envelope, you know. I don't know, is there even a line anymore out there? I mean, I would say that there is a line, but I think that people are even trying to cross that line. There are lines, you know, by and large, you know, it's like taboo to do certain things, even to this day, but people are pushing even those lines of adultery, homosexuality, transsexuality, bestiality, and sadly, even pedophilia. The lines are being pushed. They're being pushed. So, the family, as God intended in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, has been incredibly defiled by the time Genesis chapter 6 comes around, just like today. Just like today. Now, it is quite obvious that our culture is preoccupied with sex. It is. Actually, there was a study that went out, and it's estimated that the average American teenager views around 7,500 acts of sex in a year. In 1 year, in 1 year's time. It's said that the average adult views an act of sex 9,200 times in a year. And 81% of those times that they view it, it is outside the confines of the commitment of marriage. So, if 81% of the times that people are seeing these acts of sex outside of marriage, well, according to the entertainment industry, that is the norm. That's the norm. Imagine, if you would, for a moment, trying to walk with God in that kind of culture. Just imagine what that would be like. Noah did it successfully. Noah did it right. Thirdly, there was an increase in wickedness in the world at that time, according to verse 5. It happened in the earth. And then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, it says, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Other colorful translations of this say, human wickedness was growing out of bounds on the earth. Now, if you were to do a little word study from verse 5, you would see that the word wickedness and the word evil are the same Hebrew word, which is the word ra. Again, ra. It's a play on words, as if to say, God looked and saw that the wickedness or the badness of earth was really, really bad. That's what's the idea here. It was going from bad to much, much worse. Like the Apostle Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, they became futile in their thoughts. Their foolish hearts were darkened, and because they wished to refrain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind. And speaking of a debased mind, the Holy Spirit actually gives us insight into what people were thinking about at that time in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Genesis 6, it says, every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Evil thoughts continually coming out of man at that time. And so this, listen, is the centrality of the message, the theme of what we're talking about here this morning, to walk with God. Because listen, the battle, it begins in the mind, folks. It does. The thought life. Thoughts produce actions. Thoughts produce actions, and our society is increasing in wickedness. In other words, in our culture, what's paramount is expression. You know, we want to express ourselves, the freedom of expression, and that's a wonderful freedom for sure. But we don't know when to say enough is enough. We know when to say, about boundaries. As soon as we come and say, hey, that's inappropriate, well, what are we labeled as? We're labeled as bigots, is what we're labeled as. You should let us say what we want and do whatever we want in this culture. And that's our culture, and we understand that. Well, a while ago, in an article from USA Today, they were talking about why our culture continually allows a willingness, you might say, to live unethically without morals. Well, they quoted the ethics professor of Purdue University, John Pomeroy, who said, as our culture becomes more sophisticated, we think we can give up on moral responsibilities. They are simply dismissed as myths. And actually, there is quite a bit of evidence that the times of Noah were marked by a very sophisticated age and culture. So they're getting more sophisticated and believing that, morality is just kind of shackling them, holding them back from what they can really experience in this life. And while wickedness then was abounding in the earth, all over the earth, just like it is today. Fourthly, there was an increase in violence. Look at verse 11 again. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Well, we know that this all started with when Cain killed and murdered his brother Abel, the first murder. And then the second murder that's actually recorded is of this guy Lamech, who kills a young man. But not only does he kill the young man for punching him, he writes a song about it. He writes a song about, this murder that he did, and then he sang it to his two wives. And so the example of Cain in Lamech's life, it was like Lamech's great-great-great-grandpa was Cain. Well, Lamech took it to the next level and wrote a song about his murdering ways. Well, then by Genesis chapter 6, violence and murder had become an epidemic, and it filled the entire earth. It was all over the earth. In other words, because man had so definitely turned from God, he is now so filled with violence. Or you might say, in turning from God, man now turns against his fellow man. Right? You see, whenever you diminish God, you diminish life. Whenever we start to think, well, we didn't come from God, we diminish the value of life. Why is that? Because life is no longer sacred. That's why. And again, not news to us. In the U.S., over 20,000 people are murdered every year. One person every 23 minutes is murdered in the United States of America. Now, think about what we glory in today. Hollywood, right? The heroes of our children, of our teenagers, men and women, are icons of violence, glorifying violence. Well, at the time of Noah, everybody was doing it. There was this pervasive conformity to violence. Everybody's into it. Let's get into it. Remember the old saying, any dead fish can flow downstream, right? Any dead fish can go and float downstream. But what does it take? It takes a courageous, live, strong fish to go against the flow. And you know what's so great? That's what Noah did. Noah did it alone, by himself. That's Noah's world. And so we have a brief look at the world that Noah lived in. Well, let's look now at Noah's walk. Noah's world, Noah's walk. Things get a little bit more refreshing now. Verse 8. It says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in righteousness. And then it's all summed up by Noah walked with God. Now, Noah, his walk is described to us in several phrases that show us what kind of guy this actually was. This guy who in the midst of great wickedness stood up and he walked with God. First of all, if you would, verse 8, it says, but Noah found grace. Now, some translations say, but Noah found favor with God. I love the Living Bible. Paraphrase, but I still like this. The Living Bible, it renders it this way, but Noah was a pleasure to the Lord. Noah was a pleasure to the Lord. Think about that. God saw the wickedness, the darkness of the generation of Genesis chapter 6, and yet he looked at Noah and he found pleasure in him. He found pleasure in his walk. Again, I draw your attention to the very first word of verse 8. It's a conjunction. It's the word but there. But Noah, or the idea is on the contrary. Now, this is very, very important. In other words, everything that the world was, Noah was not. The world was wicked. Noah was not. The world thought evil thoughts. Noah did not. All their intentions were evil continually. Noah's were not. But Noah, or on the contrary, Noah, he stood against the crowd. Noah, he was the ultimate nonconformist. He's like the bright diamond against a dark backdrop. This is Noah. In other words, the whole world walked away from God, but Noah walked with God. Now, folks, do not get this wrong. It does not say that Noah walked away from the crowds. It does not say that. He didn't go find a little cave somewhere, to get away from all the cooties in the world. No, he walked with God in the midst of the world. He was in the world, but he was not of the world. We get that? We understand that? It goes to show that one person can stand alone, and one person can stand alone and make a difference. In 400 AD, Honorius was the emperor of Rome at that time. And the gladiator fights were in their heyday as well. The great Colosseum, they were at their peak. And supposedly, Honorius, the emperor, was a Christian because Christianity at that time had actually infiltrated Rome. Well, even so, the Colosseum was in its heyday, and thousands of people gathered there to watch the bloodletting. wrong. Men against men, beast against men. So much blood was shed on the floor of the Colosseum. Well, one day, a Syrian monk by the name of Telemachus came to Rome, and he went to the Colosseum, and he watched one of these fights for the very first time. And well, while this fight was going on, he noticed how the crowd would work themselves into a frenzy every time, somebody was killed or blood was spilled or something like that, and they're applauding and they were cheering and all of these kinds of things. Much like people applaud and cheer when they're watching violent movies and somebody gets killed during the movie. They're like, he had it coming or something like that. But Telemachus, he's seeing men disregard life so much that he runs down to the floor of the Colosseum and he jumps over the rail and he starts waving his arms, flailing his arms. Can you kind of see this little guy in the midst of the Colosseum, waving his arms back and forth, and he says, "In the name of Christ, forbear." Or the idea is, in the name of Christ, stop this. Well, the crowd thought it was part of the entertainment, part of the show, and they started to laugh. But Telemachus went after it again. "In the name of Christ, stop. In the name of Christ, stop." Well, the crowd began to realize that this guy is actually trying to stop the games. And so they began in their bloodlust to pick up rocks and throw them at Telemachus. And all the while, as he was being pelted with stones, he was crying out, "In the name of Christ, stop. In the name of Christ, stop this action." Well, the crowd ended up stoning Telemachus to the death. Well, the emperor Honorius, who is supposedly a Christian, was so ashamed by what had happened under his watch. He stopped all of the gladiator fights because of that, and there were no more fights after that. One man's courage went forth. Telemachus. Honorius said, "He's right. We've been wrong." Honorius stopped them. One man walking with God in that kind of culture made all the difference. It made all the difference. Notice further, verse 9, what describes Noah. It says, he was a just man. In the NIV, it's the word righteous. He was a righteous man. In the Hebrew, it's the word Sadiq. And it means an inward value system that was righteous. That's what it spoke about Noah, an inward value system. And listen, this is very important for us because remember, we just read that the intentions of the thoughts of men were just evil continually. Just evil continually. And so, peeking inside the mind of Noah, well, his thoughts were good, righteous, godly thoughts. Remember again, we just said that the battle to walk with God is all thought in the mind. That's where it begins. That's where the walk with God, it begins. It begins in the mind, an inward commitment to God. That's why Solomon, he wrote in Proverbs chapter 4, he said, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of the heart proceed the very issues of life." Or you might say, what you believe on the inside determines how you behave on the outside. You want to see what a person really believes? Watch how they live. Watch how they live. What you believe determines how you behave. Remember, Daniel, in Daniel chapter 1, he purposed in his heart not to defile himself. And he didn't. Noah did the same. He did the same. Now, notice the other description of Noah also in verse 9. It says, first of all, that Noah was a just man. He was a righteous man. But then it says, perfect in his generation. Perfect in his generation. The New Living Translation renders it this way. He was the only blameless man living on the earth at that time. Now, you might be saying, well, what in the world does that mean? Perfect or blameless? Because I know that I'm not perfect. I know that I'm not blameless by any mean. Well, the Hebrew word for perfect is tamim, which means sound or whole or complete or truthful or a person of integrity. That's the idea. We would say that person is authentic. They're authentic. So what you see on the outside is actually what's going on the inside. He was a man of character. He was a man without hypocrisy. You know, it's interesting because today we really do. We make a lot out of the word reputation. We make a lot out of reputation, and that's why sites like Yelp are so important and such a big deal. You know, restaurants, by the way, and stores and all over the place, they take a lot of stock in Yelp because people are getting on there and they're giving their point of view about the restaurant, about the food, about the product, whatever it is. And some of these restaurants and some of these businesses with their products are actually paying people to give them good reviews. It's all fake. They're getting $15, $20, whatever it might be. So we understand that the difference between reputation and character is huge. There's a big difference, especially when you go to a restaurant that has 5-star review and you're like, how in the world did that happen? Reputation is what everybody thinks you are. Or reputation is who you are when everybody's looking. Character is what you are when nobody's looking. That's what character is. What you are really when nobody is around. I heard of a funeral of a man who never went to church in his life, and besides that, he was a real creep. And well, the funeral was performed by a minister who had never met the man before, and you know how ministers are. He waxed eloquent. He went for it, and he described this man, how great of a man he was, and a great father, great husband, great employee, you know, all of these wonderful things. And when he had finished, everybody in the audience had this really puzzled look on their face. And the widow turned to her son and nudged him, and she said, go up to the casket and make sure that it's really your father in there, because this guy is not talking about your father. It was Will Rogers who said, live in such a way that you wouldn't be ashamed to sell your parrot to the town gossip. Live in such a way that you wouldn't feel embarrassed or ashamed to sell your parrot to the town gossip. That's the way Noah lived. That's how he lived. And it's exactly what Paul wrote about in Romans chapter 12. That a walk with God means that the outer person and the inner person become one and the same. They're one and the same. That's a perfect, complete walk with integrity. Actually, if you would, turn to Romans chapter 12. If you put your finger in there at the beginning when I told you, or if you didn't, that's fine, I'll tell you. It is the 6th book of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and then the book of Romans. We're in Romans chapter 12. And so we're going to look at the first 2 verses of Romans chapter 12 and what it means to walk with God. Paul, he comes and says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, verse 1, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. 2 important things that we get from these verses right here. Number 1, it all begins with a presentation. It all begins with a presentation, and it's this: I present my body to God. I present my body. My body, it belongs to the Lord. Here I am, Lord. Here's the encouragement. You do that every day. Do that every day. Lord, I'm yours. Use me, Lord. You do it before a date. You do it during a date. You do it when you're on a business trip. You do it on a family vacation. I am yours all the time, Lord. I'm yours. Maybe it would be a kind of a prayer, kind of like this. Lord, you know that in my body I have these certain cravings and desires that are driven like a magnet to the worldly system. But God, I give you my ears, I give you my eyes, I give you my mind, my body, my everything, so that I might be able to bring glory to you and to your kingdom. And so that's number one. There's the presentation. I present my body to God. That's number one. Number two, that kind of presentation then leads to this radical transformation. Look again, verse 2. It says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so my presenting of my body to God leads to this radical decision of not being like the crowd, not being conformed. And I like the Phillips translation. It renders it this way: don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. And so have the guts to stand up and really be a nonconformist, a true nonconformist against the worldly system. Paul uses this word transformed, our next word, and it's the Greek word metamorphosis, which is where we get our word metamorphosis. And it's a scientific, term. We understand it like metamorphosis. When a grub turns into a beautiful butterfly or a tadpole turns into a frog, there's this radical change that happens, right? So in like manner, Paul's saying, be totally changed by the presenting of your body to God. Well, that should lead then to radical change in your life. So don't be conformed. Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You're transformed totally. The outward and the inward are the same. And so Noah, he walked with God courageously. He walked against the flow courageously because Noah was changed inwardly, and that worked itself out into an outward depiction to the world around him. By the way, that leads us to our last point, and that is this: Noah's willingness. Noah's willingness. Look again, Genesis chapter 6. Verse 12, it says, so God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And it's interesting that that word pitch actually is the word in Hebrew for the word, to cover or to redeem. Cover inside and outside with pitch. And then God gives the specs for the ark. But what I want you to notice is verse 22. Thus Noah did. Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him to do, so he did. The point is this: he was willing to obey. He was willing to obey. To walk with God means I am willing to obey him. It's funny, when we hear that word obey, we almost wince as much now as we did when we were kids, when our parents sat us down and said, you obey me. We hear it again. God says, you obey me. We need to obey God. And what that means is when I walk with God, it means that I have an obedience to God. There is a willingness to obey him. Think about Noah's willingness. He built a boat on dry land. He didn't build it on a lake. He didn't build it on the ocean, on dry land. When he swung that axe for the first time and hit that gopher wood tree, I believe that took great faith. Like, I am willing to be mocked, to be scorned, to be laughed at, to stand against the crowd, right? To walk with God, to be a pleasure to the Lord. Well, he demonstrated what he believed. It was Irma Bombeck who said these words. She said, "Never go to a doctor whose office plants are dead. In like manner, why would you believe a Christian that does not obey what they say they believe?" Now, the animals that got on the ark, in pairs, we don't have a lot of time to cover the scientific parts of all those things, but I'll just say this quickly, that God instructed Noah to build 3 decks within the ark, and each section, and according to the cubit of that day, the measuring stick was 18 inches, and so if you take all of that into consideration, that means that there would be 95,700 square feet on the ark at that time, a total volume of 1,396,000 cubic feet in the ark. Gross tonnage, 13,690 tons. Comparable to a modern day vessel today, right? Well, all of that would be equivalent to 520 train cars or livestock train cars on the vessel. And so it had an enormous capacity. It wasn't a little tiny boat. All those animals came to Noah, apparently 2 termites as well, which would have taken great faith for Noah. But the point in all of this is verse 22, thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him to do, so he did. He did it all. And listen, that phrase is actually repeated over and over and over again in Genesis chapter 7. God said it, Noah did it. God said it, Noah did it. He did it. Everything that God said for Noah to do, Noah did it. He had a willingness to obey. When you live that way, you stick out. You stick out. You do not blend in. When you live that way, you stick out. Noah walked with God. He stuck out. And that's really the message here today. Go against the flow of this world. Christians should be the ultimate nonconformists. We should be. Go against the flow. Everybody does what everybody else does in this world, and then they call themselves individualists. Baloney. Baloney. Walk against the flow. Our commitment should sound like what's called the fellowship of the unashamed. The fellowship of the unashamed, and it goes like this. My face is set. My gait is fast. My goal is heaven. My road is narrow. My way is rough. My companions are few. My guide is reliable. My mission is clear. I cannot be bought, compromised, detoured, lured away, turned back, deluded, or delayed. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice, hesitate in the presence of adversity, negotiate at the table of the enemy, ponder at the pool of popularity, or meander in a maze of mediocrity. I won't shut up. I won't give up. I won't let up or slow up until I preached up, prayed up, stored up, and stayed up for Jesus Christ. Well, that's courage. That's to live differently. And you will live differently if you walk with the Lord, if you live that way. By the way, a moment ago, we got into Romans chapter 12. And one of the things that Paul the Apostle said in Romans chapter 12 is that he told us that we are to present our bodies as what? Living sacrifices. Which, by the way, is different than a dead sacrifice, right? A dead, in the Old Testament, they would take an animal and they would, boom, kill it and put it on the altar. No problem there. But when you got a living sacrifice, well, the danger of a living sacrifice is this. They have a tendency to crawl off the altar, wiggle off. Well, maybe you today are in that situation. Like, Aaron, I know this is right. Yeah, I've been squirming. I've been crawling. I don't want to be on that altar of obedience anymore. I'm not really desiring to walk with God right now. Well, let me encourage you. You need to recommit your life to God. Walk with the Lord. To say, I will walk with God, even in the midst of a generation that mirrors that of the generation of Noah. To walk with God. One man walked with God. What an encouragement to us. Let's pray.